Hello, everybody. We are continuing our series on Hegel's lectures on the philosophy of world history.
Yes, welcome. Hopefully you've all managed to keep up so far. I guess if you're here, you're enjoying it.
Or if you're just dropping in, welcome. Yeah,
welcome. So this week we're going to talk about the beginning of history and the progress of history. So the beginning of history. I quite like the way Hegel does this, because he sort of goes through all these various conceptions that people have had or are presenting in his time about how history began. And he begins with, I think, what is a staple of philosophy, the state of nature.
Yeah.
Which, so here, you've got Plato's Republic, you've got Hobbes, all these people who theorized. Rousseau, yeah, of course. And I think we shouldn't be surprised that Hegel doesn't like this idea of a state of nature. And I think basically for the reasons that we spoke about in our previous episode, about the kind of distinction that he draws, the conceptual distinction that he draws between nature and spirit. He writes, typically so this is on page 152 of the lectures. He writes, "It is customary to make of such a state an empty ideal, which misunderstands the word nature, since by nature one often means the concept or the essence of a thing." It's a nice little etymological point there about the way people use the word nature to mean both externality, what's out there, but also what's fundamental to a thing.
Yeah.
And he thinks people are guilty of this. People are confusing externality, trees and grass, with our fundamental essence.
Yeah, or they're like, looking at their own essence being reflected in these things, right? Yeah. As if they matter. Movement of the planets.
Yeah,
exactly. As such.
Yeah. And obviously, so what he dislikes about nature is that it doesn't have spirit. And what is essential, what is the nature in terms of essence of humans, is spirit.
Mm-hmm.
He writes, that state, nature, lacks freedom and is one of sensuousness. To confuse the natural condition of spirit with that state is a mistake. Spirit should not remain in this natural state because it is one of sensuous willing desire. Very similar to what we saw in the previous episode.
So it's this is all about kind of imagining a kind of prehistoric realm of humanity, a time of human beings before nature.
Mm-hmm.
Or like before society, basically.
Before society, in nature.
And then ones which they are fully immersed in nature and basically animals, right?
Well, it's strange actually, because when I think back to Hobbes, for example, it's this strange amalgam of basically behaving like animals, but having all the capacities of a human. So we have desire, we're able to reflect on what we want, we're able ultimately to conceive of what it is for us to be safe and free and to give that over to the sovereign when it comes to it.
Yeah.
But at the same time, we're behaving like animals.
Well, yes and no. So I think, at this stage in Hegel's lectures, he's kind of thinking about the human state of nature that is as much as close to nature, right? But then he kind of thinks about a second level, which is humanity in its maximal investment in sensuousness and nature, right? They're being as much as possible like animals. But I think what Hobbes was talking about in the state of nature is a little different, because he claims there that it's our consciousness that is actually the source of the violence in the state of nature. It's not our animality, it's consciousness. Because we see each other equally entitled to stuff. And that is the source of the problem.
Okay.
Yeah.
But isn't that ultimately rooted in his sort of his materialism? So it comes from our instincts.
No.
Okay.
I see you having that, nice wall there. I would like that too, because I am conscious just as you are. So why should you have that more than me? And off we go. Violent medieval feudalism.
Okay, right.
So Hobbes' story is a little bit more complex than human beings just being animals. It's actually our consciousness that gets us into the kind of violence that we do in state of nature.
Okay.
But what is the natural part in the state of nature for Hobbes, I think, is that human beings are not aware of what's motivating them, what's guiding them. And in that respect, I think it really maps onto what Hegel's saying in his portrayal of the state of nature a little bit further on, where we are maximally influenced and immersed in our sensuousness and what is immediate and our desires.
Responding to stimuli.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
So he then concludes the paragraph by saying, it belongs to the concept of spirit to be by sublating the form of its sensuous existence, and in this way positing itself as free. So we are free when we aren't just responding to immediacy, to external stimuli.
Yeah, or not being in the completely under the yoke of the sensuous existence. Yeah.
Right.
It's interesting he says positing, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
that is already a developed moment of thinking. And it's a form of making things explicit.
Well, exactly. It's the activity of spirit that, I mean, yeah, without going too much into what we discussed last time, I guess it's the activity of positing what you see outside of yourself as being a moment of yourself. And in that moment of seeing yourself in that, you are free.
Well, it doesn't need to be something outside of yourself. It can also be your own desires and feelings.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
But you just turn them into, okay, I'm not just feeling this and that. I can also think in a broader context that I will be around tomorrow. I will have different desires. How do I manage these desires vis-a-vis potential desires tomorrow and what I would like to do in 5 years, right?
And then in the next paragraph, he briefly alludes to this tradition of conceiving of a primitive state of the human race. And here he mentions the Mosaic tradition. But he doesn't really discuss this that much. It's interesting to actually understand why he doesn't want to discuss it that much, and it's because it's something that actually has had historical existence. It is the existence of a people.
Yeah.
So it's not the beginning, but it is of a real historical moment.
I'm not sure. What does it mean by Mosaic tradition? Does it mean like the stories in the Bible?
Yeah. The Old Testament.
Okay. Well, the thing there that is maps onto natural state is the garden scene, isn't it?
I'm not sure if he is talking about that, because he does write, the Mosaic tradition is pertinent here, although it has no place of its own at the beginning, since it is from a time when it had a historical existence, i.e., an existence in the being of a people. We do not begin with it. So he's not taking seriously any ideas about creation, maybe, but instead refer to it in the era when the promise it contains is fulfilled. Then for the first time, it takes on a historical existence.
I'm not, yeah. because you can talk about the Mosaic tradition from within, okay, talking about the various stories, or you can look at it externally and see it was something that occurred for a particular people in a particular setting.
Yeah.
It sounds like the second thing.
Yeah. In the being of the people. I mean, he must be talking about the Judaic peoples after the facts, after the accounts in the Bible.
The Judaic people's front.
Well, just thinking forward, when he might talk about Persia or Egypt, he might refer to Jews then, and so the Mosaic tradition would then be the tradition that they then take on in their present existence. So what you said. Prior to that, it was lifeless and had not been taken up into the culture of peoples.
Yeah.
So the historical existence that the Mosaic tradition takes and has is when it is an active set of beliefs that is held by, I assume, the Jewish people, but maybe the Christians as well. I'm not sure. Yeah. I'm not sure how he's going to take it.
Yeah. So I want to raise the point of what animal and nature further have to do with Hegel's account of a few paragraphs down. Is there anything else you want to add before I go there?
Is that the paragraph which begins, "What is human cannot have developed from animal super?" Yeah, I think that's great. I will just mention one thing, and then feel free to just go straight into that. And then in the next paragraph, he goes on to talk about this idea that there was a primeval people which was extremely advanced. And he also critiques this view of human development in the philosophy of nature. And the idea basically is that you had everything, like you had the perfect conception, the perfect form of a human. And it is from this perfect form that you get degradations of it. And so it's a way of explaining our current formation. Obviously, Hegel dislikes that. And he says some really interesting things about why that conception grates against his idea of how consciousness arose. He writes, "The conception here is simply that human beings have not risen into consciousness and reason from instinct, from the stupor of animals, that humanity as such cannot have begun animal stupor." So he likes that, but what he doesn't like then is this idea that we could have that pure knowledge, if you will, or reason is something that begins fully formed. He doesn't like this idea that we just begin with knowing everything. For Hegel, it's all about the dialectical process, the labor of the concept, to use a very typical expression. What I find interesting about this criticism of this view, ignoring the fact that it's obviously false, is that Hegel is just completely discarding the possibility of intellectual intuition in the sort of the rationalist sense, in the way that people typically conceived of how God intuited the world, of knowing everything immediately without any effort. For Hegel, reason is not already apparent to itself. It's something that it has to come to know. It's already there, but it's not apparent to itself as there.
Yeah.
And that speaks a lot to his view of how history develops, of the eternity of the concept. We spoke about that, I think, in the first episode, the eternity of the concept that's always there. But we still have to understand that we have to know that it's there. And this view just goes against that.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's a good point, Helios, that you bring out there. It's well put. Precisely that the reason needs to be something developmental, and that aligns more with our actual experience and history to think in those terms. But that Hegel provides this rational justification for how it must be like this. I would just add another thing to this topic, and that is you could also critique it from a different angle and say, much more, maybe more obviously, is like, okay, if you had this high culture, this great society, why aren't we in it? If it was so great, why did it collapse? Or why did it vanish? Or why did it decline? If it was really as perfect or great as you say, then it shouldn't have declined. We should have continued living in it and, living in its splendor. Where is Atlantis? Come on, show it to me.
We want Atlantis.
Where is it? If it was so great and fantastic, why is it at the bottom of the ocean?
Yeah. Yeah. It's like a bizarre fantasy of trying to explain both our troubles, but also our abilities to do things.
Yeah, it's a weird mixture of trying to explain our troubles and ignore them.
Yeah.
Because you actually don't deal with your troubles that way. You just posit some perfect society, things are better in the good old days kind of situation.
Yeah.
Okay.
Do you want to say what you want to say about the humans and animals?
Yes. Let's dive into that. So it's the next paragraph here. You don't need to go paragraph by paragraph all the time, but especially this paragraph, we kind of see very clearly, I think, Hegel's anti-evolutionary stance, right?
Yes.
Spirit does not develop out of the animal. It does not begin from the animal. It begins from spirit and so on and so forth, right? Yes. So don't think...
There is a bit of a nuance there, right?
Okay. There, go on. Yeah.
It's that if we begin with a natural state, what we find is an animal-like humanity, not an animal nature, not animal stupor. So there is this sort of first stage of immediacy where we are animal-like, humans, but animal-like insofar as, I think this must refer to the sensuousness of being stuck in sensuousness.
Immersed in sensuousness, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
But we're not, but our nature is not animal because there's already spirit there. Spirit's already present, but it's implicit. We haven't posited it. It hasn't posited itself yet.
Yeah. Okay, yes. I recognize that there's a difference between the two. However, it is still how that doesn't seem to square well with the story of evolution at all, right?
It doesn't, no.
So what is it, Hegel? Do we just people just pop out, from the ground, like the elves and the dwarves? They just awaken, as in Tolkien's story.
Excellent reference. I think that's a really interesting question, and it's something that I've personally thought a lot about because I'm interested in Hegel's criticism of evolution. Many contemporary defenders of Hegel will say that Hegel never had the opportunity to read Darwin's theory of evolution. He read earlier notions of evolution which were not as sophisticated as Darwin's, or were actually slightly different.
Mm-hmm.
But I think still Hegel would not like Darwin's theory of evolution because he doesn't like the idea that... So a bit of a tangent here. But in the philosophy of nature, in the organic section, the three broad sections are like geology, earth-like stuff, plants and animals. And these things, these categories, these determinations, do not develop naturally. Or rather, the explanation for why you go from plant to animal is not a natural explanation, it's a conceptual explanation. There are conceptual reasons for why you get from plants to animals. And so Hegel would hate the idea that you get plants to animals because of random mutations, for example, contingency. No, there has to be a necessary reason for why it happens. What that means is something that I have not been able to figure out yet. With respect to animal-like humanity and animal nature, sometimes I wonder whether a good way of thinking about it would be like there is just this something happens. So like insert natural phenomena, and there is just like a spark, and the animal sort of automatically becomes the human, or and then that's it. You have spirit, and there's no turning back from that. But that's a very dissatisfying explanation. I accept it.
Yeah, but it wouldn't kind of fundamentally be against evolution, though.
No, it wouldn't.
Yeah.
The tension would be in the explanation. I think the explanation can't be contingency. So I think even though there is no theory that explains why consciousness arises, I get the impression that the general thrust of any argument would be it happened randomly, or because of a chance mutation, or something along those lines.
Yeah, yeah.
Whereas Hegel would want it to be a necessary development.
Yeah.
Now, yeah, I'm not quite sure how exactly that would be expressed.
Yeah.
In non-conceptual language.
Well, leaving Hegel aside and just thinking about evolution as such, right?
Yeah.
Yes, there are random mutations, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Contingencies happen and so on, but the whole story isn't just randomness and contingency. It's more like certain development, takes place in and through randomness and contingency, where contingency and randomness could provide opportunities, or they could provide a detriment, right? And that sort of defines whether or not a species is going to be successful in its circumstances or not. So the life form is kind of trying to do its best to pursue its goal, whatever that is, right?
Yeah.
Depends on which biologist you ask, what that goal might be. But in this life form, through successive generations, trying to do its thing, you could call that a kind of necessity onto itself, and that could be in line with Hegel, except it just doesn't know it, of course, as nothing in nature knows what it is doing.
Yeah.
But Hegel sees in animals and plants that there is self-organization, right? So there is an implicit freedom there.
So there is self-organization in plants and animals respectively. What I think the problem is when you try to give an evolutionary account of why plants develop into animals or something like that. Mm-hmm. And it seems to me that the conceptual relationship between the plant and the animal, this sort of thing that links one to the other, for an evolutionary theory has to be chance. And I don't think Hegel wants to say that the transition from plant to animal is one of contingency. He wants to say it's one of necessity.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I'm not well enough versed in the details of evolution.
Sure. Yeah. Maybe
so like why certain mutations eventually lead to the explicit form of plant animals, as we know them, those concrete shapes. On the face of it, that doesn't seem very contingent at all. They're very specific, very honed kind of life forms.
Well, it's contingent because the theory goes, I think you had lots of attempts.
Yeah.
And all the shit ones died.
Yeah, but why do you have attempts? What is attempting something? Why?
That's just language. I mean, they would hate that if you said this. We use teleological language to explain it, but it's not teleological in itself.
It just does stuff.
It just stuff happens. No,
it just spontaneously does, pops.
Yeah, exactly. But I think it's a fascinating question. How Hegel, what would be Hegel's view on contemporary evolutionary theory, and what his response might be as well. What might be his alternative? He has this idea almost of animals. He gives the image of Minerva coming out of Zeus's head, fully formed.
Yes.
And he gives that idea. That seems to be how he thinks animals and plants come into being. I don't think he would like the idea.
But isn't he talking about spirit there when he talks about Minerva?
He's talking about the appearance of, I think maybe in that example, but I think it's more generally, it's a general point about the development of categories of determinations. You don't have the gradual appearance of a plant. You have a plant. You have an animal.
Yeah.
You have a human. There's no indeterminate moment where you have something that's kind of animal or something that's kind of human.
Yeah, but also in actual evolutionary terms, you never have a kind of sort of animal. There's always a certain life form that is functioning at every stage, right?
Yeah.
It's just that when we stretch it across millions of years, we then see these different shapes kind of and their differences becoming evident.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
yeah.
He wouldn't like, I think, the idea that there is no moment where a plant, so when such a huge tangent, when plants become animals, right, it's a gradual process of mutations. And I suppose theoretically you should be able to point at discrete moments in time where the successive mutations occur such that it stops being a plant and it starts being an animal. Because it's not like evolutionary theory wouldn't think that in T1 you have plant, in T2 you have animal. It's T1 you have plant, T2 plant plus mutation, T3 plant plus mutation plus mutation. Mm-hmm. And at Tn, that's eventually going to become an animal.
Yeah.
It's always a plant in the meanwhile. Well, I guess it is. I'm not actually sure what they would think about that. And it's going to become an animal. I think Hegel doesn't like this thing, this idea that it's gradually becoming, in natural terms, it's gradually becoming an animal. I think, yeah.
Yeah, he doesn't like that. Indeed, but I think that his philosophy could maybe accommodate it.
I think it depends on what you end up thinking the necessary determinations of nature are. Because if the necessary determinations are the plant and the animal, I'm not sure it does.
Well, what about mushrooms, fungi? They're neither plant nor animals. What are you gonna do? Yeah.
I don't know.
How'd you like them categories?
You should rewrite it and insert the fungus.
Fungi, yeah.
Shall we return to world history?
So let me just end by saying, this is a hot topic. It's one of Hegel's, might even say, serious weak points in his thinking, something that's really outdated in his philosophy and philosophy of nature. But it also, I think, speaks to how we think of natural development and development in time. Because
go
on the one hand, isn't dialectic all about switching into, into the negative, into new forms, right?
Yes.
Just boom, something else just pops there, right?
Yeah.
Seems like this is happening all over the place in evolution. Why wouldn't Hegel be happy with that? It's not that development is occurring between the two opposed moments, but through a series of things. So you need to have many moments before you get development. It's the same thing in conceptual terms in Hegel's philosophy, right? So it seems like the conceptual apparatus is potent, is strong enough to kind of think this.
I think randomness ultimately makes it incompatible.
It appears random at first.
In Hegel's defense, you make a very good point. But in Hegel's defense, there is no explanation for how any of these things happen yet. The randomness is posited as an ideal, but there is no explanation for how life emerges from non-life, or for how plants emerge into animals, or how consciousness arises from.
Or why there are 67 species of parrots,
for example. So, I mean, Hegel.
Or how many there are.
Maybe these answers will appear, but Hegel is not, entirely in bad company by being skeptical of natural explanations for these phenomena. But anyway, I don't know.
And sure, and if you open up a textbook on, biology and stuff, they will start with the familiar. They will start with what is explicit to us and talk about animals and plants in very Aristotelian terms. So it's not that outdated in terms of like what is the conceptual fundamental structures that are still at work in distinguishing this stuff moving around us. Yeah,
we should do a series on the philosophy of nature.
Yes, look out, people, for a series on the philosophy of nature coming to your nearest YouTube in 2036.
Yeah. If you thought this text was long,
it's in its immediacy right now. It hasn't yet awakened. Right?
It's extremely implicit.
Hasn't started positing itself yet.
No,
it will though.
I'm happy to go straight to the progress of history, unless you want to say something.
No, I think we can do that. Yeah, let's jump into there.
Okay.
I have a thing I want to talk about in regards to time.
Oh, good. Yeah, excellent. Okay, feel free to.
All right, so let's get into the progress of history. And the thing I want to bring up is time, because there Hegel talks a bit about time itself. Anything do you want to get at first, maybe?
Back in the philosophy of nature. We're not leaving the philosophy of nature. I think it's quite just a very broad systematic point. I think it's quite elegant and intriguing how Hegel is constantly referring to more to earlier parts of this system and bringing them in and showing how they're all part of this thing. Time is the most primitive form of self-negation and self-externality, and history takes place in self-externality, and it occurs in time, therefore. And I think it's just really, it speaks to his systematic ambitions that he's talking about time here.
Indeed.
And he's talking about it in these conceptual ways. He writes, because it is the development of spirit that contains its self-negation occurs in time. I just think, that's all I have to say, though. Please, do you have something to say?
Yeah. Well, its spirit is also living and embodied. So as living and embodied, it is folded in and through time. But he gives a little bit about, the concept of time here, just independently. And he says, I'm just going to, find the page here. It's 155. The quality of the negative is intrinsic to time. For us, it is something positive, an event or happening. But what characterizes time is that the opposite can also happen, the relationship of what has being to its non-being. And this relationship is time, insofar as we do not merely think the relationship, but also actually intuit it. The abstract intuition of being and non-being is time. Time is the wholly abstract realm of the sensible, and then talks about duration and so on, which is just building on the same thing. So he is cashing out what time is in his kind of conceptual terms. And what do we understand with time here?
He's drawing some kind of connection between time and what's inner for us. So he says, he calls it the negative that is intrinsic. Sorry, no, he calls, no, sorry. Where is it? The relationship of,
the quality of the negative is intrinsic to time. That's
yeah, no, I didn't want to quote that. Time is the wholly abstract realm of the sensible. And he talks a lot about how in the philosophy of spirit, when he gets to the consciousness chapter, he talks about time there as well.
Mm-hmm.
And he talks about how, again, there is this abstract mode of self-negation, which there is, and so there is something temporal about the activity of our inner workings.
Okay. But I'm interested in just what is time as such, like the conception he gives us here of it, not so much as it is for us, even though that plays a role here as well.
Okay.
But I think he's saying something about time itself.
Okay. So I guess the first thing to point out is that it is the negative.
Well, it says the negative is intrinsic to time, but it doesn't just equate the negative to time.
No. So the negative is intrinsic to time. Then he says, for us, it is something positive, an event or happening.
Mm-hmm. That's already another layering, like that's us.
That is a further layering.
Experiencing it, yes.
Yeah. But what characterizes time is that the opposite can also happen. And so time seems to be the self-negation of being and non-being. The movement of time, the dialectic of time, is the dialectic of what is to what is not.
Yeah.
And this relationship is time.
Yes.
The abstract intuition of being and non-being is time. I mean, so he's also casting our minds back to the logic, to the beginning of quality, where we talk about being and non-being. And he's saying the abstract intuition. So it's not the pure thought of being and non-being, it is the intuition of being and non-being. So so he's saying it's sensible. It's something that's sensible but abstract. And he's making a connection with the more foundational conceptual structure of being and non-being.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Well, so his use of intuition here, probably the German is Anschauung.
Yeah, probably.
Which should be probably better translated as kind of beholding.
Okay.
It is something kind of a kind of immediate form of experience. And there's a lot of, kind of connection with Kant here, because Kant also sees time as part of the sensible, but it's the purely sensible.
Yeah.
So is Hegel's, when he says wholly abstract realm, does that equate to pure in Kant's terms?
So for Kant, time is a pure intuition, right? I think the main difference, well, I wonder if this is a contention within Kant scholarship. It's been a while since I've read the Transcendental Aesthetic. But if I remember correctly, what makes it a pure intuition is that time is for us. It's our way,
Yeah.
one of our ways of intuiting the world.
Yes, it's part of our transcendental apparatus. Yes.
Whereas for Hegel, it's a real feature of the world.
Yeah, although in this paragraph, it's kind of marred with how it is for us. So it's very hard to kind of extract the pure concept of time from the how time appears to spirited beings.
I mean, look, in the philosophy of nature, where he talks about time,
you should know, yes, that's your domain.
He makes no reference to beings. The same goes for space. Space first, then time follows, logically from space. And he says very much the same thing here, even though actually there he slightly emphasizes the concept of becoming. But
does he not mention being in?
He does mention being and non-being.
Yeah.
But he also mentions becoming there. But I think if we look primarily at philosophy of nature, we'll see that it's I think, without question the case, because Hegel also takes Kant to task for this, that time is not something for us. You're very right, though, to point out that here he gives it that spin. And I wonder whether it's because we're talking about history or time in history, which is, so if you're talking about time in history, it only makes sense to talk about it as something that is being intuited by self-conscious beings.
Yes, so it's already kind of something for spirit. It's kind of pointless to discuss it as a natural concept and just speak
That's
of it.
That's a very nice observation, actually, Filip, because it also takes us. Earlier, I was sort of saying that I like the systematicity of Hegel's philosophy. That could have also been read as a kind of reductionism. I think what you're pointing out speaks against that. Hegel, we can't just reduce the concept of history to the concept of time, precisely because time in history is conceptually different to time as such, or time in nature.
Well, I don't know if we should carve up time itself like this. Maybe it's a question of what time means versus how it is, right? So how it is in nature is just going to be how it is, whereas what time means for historical self-conscious beings is going to be different because we bring into it all these extra things like Charles III, whoever, right? All these signifiers we have of what we put into it.
Yeah, no, you're right. I should have expressed that better. Instead of talking about what time means for history and what time means for itself, I should have said time in history. We wouldn't want to reduce history to time.
No, I agree with that. Yeah, that's good. That's
how
good.
I should have phrased it. That's how I should have phrased it. You're very right, what you said.
But still, okay, within this perspective of how time is for self-conscious beings, time itself sort of plays the roles of the contingent element. He says what characterizes time is that the opposite can also happen. And so it has this being and non-being, similar to how you have what is equally possible and actual, which is how it characterizes contingency in the logic. So maybe that is what time means for self-conscious beings, is that it's the plane of contingency, and that is within this plane that we build structures of necessity. We build institutions, we build epochs, and so on and so forth, and that will have different meanings depending on where they're located on this plane. But the plane itself is, no longer just contingent, even though that's fundamentally still going to be there.
Very nice. Yeah. I think that view has quite a bit of mileage.
Yeah, and as he says at the end of this paragraph, cultural formation, because it is the development of spirit, also contains its self-negation, occurs in time.
Yeah.
So we never will get away of this contingency that we're in, but we can turn it against itself and refashion it according to what we want from it, or according to our needs.
Yeah, I don't want to go down another philosophy of nature rabbit hole, so I'm just going to say something, and if you want to pick it up, you can. If you want to just leave it, that's fine as well. So Hegel does say that nature is the realm of contingency, and especially in the very beginning of nature, space and time, where relations are conceptually external to each other, contingency seems to be quite central, even though the development from one moment to the other is necessary. So, okay, that's the point. Therefore, I'm not sure how to properly understand this idea that nature is a sphere of contingency with respect to the determinations of nature. Maybe this takes us back to our discussion about evolution. I wonder whether we can say that time is this plane of contingency, or in time, well, yeah. But yeah.
Yes, I think that's a topic for another time.
Yeah, exactly. Good. It was very wise of you not to pick that up.
Yeah, but contingency, in my meaning, just meant as it appears for self-conscious beings. Made no comment really about the state of nature, like the philosophy of nature and what's going on there.
Yeah. Okay, fair enough. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, good. Okay, good. And then he goes on to talk about, okay, so I guess this is actually kind of relevant to the kind of discussion we've been having now, because he's talking about the difference in the conceptual difference in how things change in nature and how things change in spirit, or in the realm of spirit.
Yeah.
So he writes, in nature, classes and species, Gattungen, endure. So the planets move from place to place, but the orbit persists.
Yeah.
And it is the same with animal species. Alteration here is cyclical, constant repetition of the same. This is why nature is tedious. No surprise that Hegel doesn't hold nature in such high regard in the philosophy of art.
Yeah, well, Hegel never lived to see when Chihuahuas became a thing. That would have been a refutation of his
nothing
entire
tedious
thesis
about
here.
those things. Yeah.
No.
So what's going on here? Why does he say that in nature nothing new is produced? Everything happens in cycles.
I think that links back into what we talked about earlier regarding evolution, that, well, there is no development from plant to animal or single-celled organism to multicellular organisms, what have you, right? It seems like the forms are just there. Boom. Like it's just pig, cat, dog, they're there. They're done. Finished. There's no alteration of the form dog such that then it then becomes a demon hound of like Chihuahua. Hellspawn.
Yeah. So I guess
it's piggybacking off of that thought, I think. And so, and yet the forms are the same. Animals are still born and die and kind of have generations, and so it's just a cycle. It's just repeating, what are you going to get when another dog is born from this dog? Well, another, just the same dog, same form, basically.
Yeah, I think that's right.
And so it's cyclical, and that's why it's tedious. It's boring.
There's no progress.
Yes.
In nature, the species makes no progress, but in spirit, the change presses to a new stage, and every change is progress.
I think that's because of spirit's ability to turn itself into a moment of itself. We live in the 21st century. We are constantly looking back. Okay, what kind of dumb shit were we up to the 20th century, 19th century, 18th century, 17th century? Man, there's a lot of
getting crazier.
A lot of bad things we did. We were very nasty with each other, right? And we keep that in mind.
Yeah.
Maybe it shouldn't. It's an idea not to be so nasty next time.
Yeah, he does say in nature, the process falls apart. The connective matrix is only interior and not apparent. The transition appears only to the thinking spirit, which comprehends it. So I think you're very right there. Because nature doesn't think itself, doesn't think through its own process, it can't have, there can't be any progress in nature.
Yeah, and it's we who do the philosophy of nature and then link up all the various dimensions of nature: time, space, matter, gravity, other kinds of physics, and then life forms, etc. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
We are the ones who kind of make science, and in doing this science, we are already systematizing with the world, putting it into the form of knowledge. And while it doesn't change the natural things when they're known by us, it does change us, because knowing things is fundamentally our existence, is fundamentally how we go through life and experience things. It is as knowers, and we live in the plane of knowing.
Yes, we are knowers in the plane of knowing.
And we need to expand this plane.
Yeah.
Make it bigger, deeper, richer.
Yeah. And this, yeah, exactly.
And there's no cycles here. Yeah.
This is an important point for people to bear in mind when we're talking about the progress of world history. That we've said it many times, I think we should keep repeating it, that the significant aspect of world history is the coming to know of world history. It's not just that shit happens, it's understanding that it happens according to certain rational developments.
Yeah, figuring out reasons why things happen.
Exactly.
I mean, that's basically a natural imperative in historical thinking. I think people are just drawn to that, okay, why did the Second World War happen? They're going to be lots of ideas.
Perennial question.
Right? Yeah. Now, this, I think, as I mentioned, links up with the previous thought that is Hegel's fundamental anti-evolutionary stance. And I think this too maybe can be challenged in some fashion, right? That maybe the forms of nature aren't as static as Hegel thinks they are, and that maybe they share something of a kind of conceptual dynamics of dialectic and development.
Yeah, it's difficult to understand exactly what because obviously, as in the previous quote I said, the connective matrix is only interior. Now that's still important. That still means there is conceptual dynamism in nature. That still means that the reason we go from space to time is because of dialectic. What's missing is this self-realization of its own process.
Yeah.
So I wonder, maybe you're right. Yeah, maybe Hegel is being unduly critical, because I think his system does have the resources to assign a greater degree. I mean, is it not progress that animals develop into humans, or that, I guess progress would be a wrong way to put it. I'm not sure.
Well, if looking at what happens in evolution, things start out as single-celled organisms, very basic, right?
Yeah,
And then they develop, and in Aristotelian terms, they become more free in that development.
they do, exactly.
They
Yeah,
grow appendages, you know, they form an interiority with specialized organs, being super good at breaking down food, sucking up the juices, the good stuff, and making you a powerful, right?
yeah. I
So
think I
yeah.
think the kind of freedom that Hegel assigns to the animal does open the space for conceiving of the philosophy of nature as a progression, as a development that involves progress. If you think that freedom is important to Hegel's project, which I think obviously it is. So yeah, yeah. Maybe
Well, so this I think would be, you know, new work that needs to be done, because in so some of the conceptual thought is I think compatible, can open up to this, but at the same time I think you're also right to highlight that um, real progress really only happens in the realm of knowing, of knowledge, and of spirit, right?
right. Yeah. So
So
I guess the idea is, yeah, I mean, an animal would never conceive of itself as being a moment of progress from plants. It can't conceive of itself as freer than a plant, whereas spirit does conceive itself as being freer.
oh yeah, we've never been as free as we are now in this time.
Insert meme with American Eagle.
Yeah. So I want to skip ahead a little bit, a few pages down,
Yeah, good. I agree.
where Hegel talks about over refinement as leading to a people's decline and destruction. It kind of gives I don't know, the life cycles of a particular form of spirit or a nation.
Mm,
You know, it's development, refinement, over refinement, and decline.
yeah,
Yeah.
I think these pages are fascinating. Maybe we should begin by first looking at Hegel's definition of cultivation, because that's the first moment in this development that eventually ends in decline.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What do you think?
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So if we look at the top of page 158, Hegel writes, cultural formation or cultivation in a general sense concerns the formal aspect and does not yet specify anything in regard to content. What constitutes cultivation is in general the formal aspect of the universal. And then a few lines down, he repeats again this whole universal thing. He writes that thus humans act not merely in accord with their inclinations, desires, and particularities. Maybe a slight dig here at the idea of sensuousness. Rather, they restrain themselves, rein themselves in, thereby allowing the objects per se more freedom. They conduct themselves more theoretically, respecting the right and freedom of the object.
Mm-hmm.
What are your thoughts?
It's interesting how he immediately connects cultivation with the universal.
Yeah.
That means that in being cultivated, properly cultivated in Hegel's sense, you are taken into the um, the kind of existence of the universal, the life of the universal. You see yourself as a moment of some bigger whole, right? Bigger thing.
Yeah.
And then
100%.
you see that your actions and behavior will have some sort of outcome on this whole, and therefore you will moderate yourself, mediate yourself.
Exactly. Because you see your actions and behaviors as being part of the outcome of this whole, you will, ideally, if you're cultivated, you will act in accordance with this whole, so that what you're
Yes.
doing will be a reaffirmation of it, or will at least reach towards it.
And another way of looking at this also is that you can only be cultivated by having the universal come into you and activate itself in you, right? It's language, customs, various social behaviors, etc., right? These are all part of groups, group dynamics that entrench themselves in you, such that your immediate intuitions and desires become supplanted or replaced or sort of supported or buttressed by this element coming inside of you. And I think this is kind of why Hegel sees human beings as special, is that we are very specialized in this kind of behavior, in the sense that we are extremely vulnerable and empty coming into the world. We take a long time to grow and develop, unlike animals. Cat, born, done. It's like your cat now. Go do your thing, right? Next. Human beings take a long time, but that's because it's just a huge kind of software update.
Yeah.
We have we're working with universal hardware machinery that needs the universal. We need the latest patch of the universal. Give us. I want the universal 3.0.
Not Windows Vista, Universal 3.0.
God no. Be Windows 11.
But right, okay. So one like immediate concern about this might be that his picture of cultivation is impersonal. That it doesn't matter who you are. All that matters is that you just subjugate yourself to whatever the dominant culture that you find yourself in is. Yeah. But I think Hegel guards against this, because in the next sentence he writes, so the next sentence from what I just quoted, connected with this is an individualized treatment of the aspects of the object, a closer consideration of the concrete situation at hand, an analysis of circumstances, and a pinpointing of the aspects of the object. This individualization is directly what gives these aspects the form of the universal, because they are abstracted and considered each for itself. So it seems to me that there is this, so it's universal, I take it, because it's common to all, it's shared. It doesn't have the particularities of individuals, but it can only be expressed through the activity of an individual. And that's not just an empty formality. It actually gets dyed with the individuality of the subject.
Yeah.
The endpoint will still be the universal, but it'll be, Leonardo's universal or Michelangelo's universal.
Yeah.
And that's why you get, I guess, why Hegel would say you get slightly different expressions of the same thing in a culture, why you don't have just a series of the same stuff. What do you think about that?
No, I think that's right. Once individuality and singularity doesn't become drowned out in the universal, it actually becomes realized, right?
Yeah.
And that you can think of diplomats acting and representing their state, right? They should be a reflection of their state, but it's also as much a reflection of themselves, like Talleyrand. And how one goes about doing certain things, because there are different degrees of skill involved and so on in this profession or way of being. Even though you're acting upon a greater whole, it's still you acting on that greater whole, and so something of you is as well represented in how well you can do it or find things out or figure out solutions.
Yeah.
Oh,
that's a fantastic analogy. Yeah, I like that. Yeah, I mean, we might just conclude with, what Hegel writes towards the bottom of that paragraph: because cultivated persons take into account and register the various aspects, they can act more concretely. Because the universal by itself is just abstract, but what we want the concrete universal. That's what we are looking for in history. And then we also mentioned this in I think in the first video, the importance of the work or the deed.
Before we move on to another topic, I would just want to add that Hegel does talk about how the universal might be alienating, because in the phenomenology of spirit, in a spirit chapter in the middle of it, he talks about culture as an alienating force, as how spirit is alienated from itself. So
why does that happen?
It's very crudely put, it is because the world you find yourself in, although it is the product of self-consciousness, you haven't seen those products as results. You see them as beginnings for you. You see them as something immediate, even though they have been worked for and mediated by others and been their achievement. For you, it's not an achievement. It's something external out there. It's just there. And you don't recognize yourself in it. And so it feels alien and strange.
Okay.
Yeah.
Very nice. Yes. Okay.
Yeah. So whenever somebody is growing up in the human world, it's always a pain in the ass.
Yeah.
Right? Like, you have a lot of designs and projects.
People are always talking about this. Who cares about that?
Yeah, I'm gonna just play with my Legos. Yeah. I don't want to study. Screw that shit.
Yeah. Good. Yeah, that's really interesting how that can happen.
Yeah, so there's moments of alienation involved in culture as well. He doesn't bring that
ultimately,
out here.
What, again, very crudely, what reconciles you with that culture, with the universality?
The question, what reconciles?
Yeah.
The answer might be twofold. On the one hand, you learn the customs and behaviors and so on of the culture, which gives you power, which enables you to become a professional or somebody who can produce services and goods for others, and you become important and whatnot. So that's one way in which it can happen. Another way is, well, maybe there is really something fundamentally alienating about this world, because you have powerful desires or things of your own that are just not expressed in the world around you. And then it might require a conflict to occur. So I think here where great historical persons come into the picture, and thinking about, I don't know, Caesar or Alexander, right? Alexander, I'm not happy with just moping around here on this, among these Greek city-states. I want to go out there and kick Persia's ass, right? That's what is, how I can recognize myself in the world. Or doesn't need to be a political figure, can also be an artist, I think. Or any other kind of achievement that can be done. So maybe there is a struggle and conflict involved there. So it's not all just smooth sailing.
Right.
So the answer is basically twofold.
Yeah.
And in the second step regarding great people, artists, conquerors, and so forth, they lead the world into conflict, and from that conflict, and a new form of spirit emerges eventually, right?
Okay.
So they solve the alienation differently.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Okay. So Hegel is kind of presupposing this and just sort of assuming, or rather, he's just thinking about subjects that are already in tune to the universal.
Yes, which can actually work on both sides of the two poles I just mentioned, because he sees great historical people as bringing out a new reality, which then becomes moment of the historical development, right? So, yeah, they're at the end, they all fold into the great world history.
Good. Okay, so just to pick up on what I was going to say then, it's this idea that what matters is the deed, it's the action.
Yeah.
He writes, in history, this distinction, the distinction between what a human being is inwardly, what their attributes are, and what their actions are, this distinction comes to nothing, because what human beings are is their actions.
Yep.
They are themselves the result of their actions.
Yeah. Super important point.
Right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Is it Neville Chamberlain, right? We don't give a shit about your intentions, what you thought Hitler was going to do. Your actions led to that, outcome.
So as an
example, yeah.
It's a really interesting point, actually, because I think Neville Chamberlain's actually a bad example, because his inaction is an action in his case, because he's prime minister of a significant nation in World War II.
But he still was acting in some sense.
Exactly, he was.
His action was, but he had intentions, right? He thought that Hitler would be satisfied with, and so on and so forth, and that it wouldn't be a problem. So, with those intentions, his actions are justified. It's just that we don't care about those intentions because it's all about action at the end of the day. That was my point.
Right, I see. Okay.
Yeah. So everybody's always acting, even though they're inacting, being passive. That's still an action.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Which is a very interesting view. I think it's probably controversial. I imagine people wouldn't like this view very much, that what matters is the actions and not the intentions in history, because if you have a bunch of really good people who want to do good things and who don't manage to do them, they just kind of become irrelevant, whereas I think we'd like to hold them in higher esteem.
Well, they do become irrelevant.
Yeah.
Because they get drowned out by the people who did something.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, right? That's the way.
Just do it.
Just do it.
Exactly. Yeah.
Man, what are you waiting for?
LaBeouf knows what it's all about. Yeah. The truth is that the outward does not differ from what is inward.
Yes.
And it is misleading to draw this distinction. A series of deeds is not to be distinguished from what is inward.
History is what is revelatory. And you don't reveal anything through just intending. You have to do it.
Yeah.
So, and I think when we, leaving Hegel out of the picture, if we just look at some sort of historical podcast, or it's all what happened, what occurred, the actions people took, and then secondarily to that is their intentions, but it always follows on the primary thing is the action. What gets done.
So intentions are not important for our understanding of world history. They may be important for the story we want to tell about a certain historical event, when we want to flesh out all the details. But when we're thinking about what moves history forward, it's actions. It's not intentions.
Yeah.
Bold move, Hegel. Bold move.
Very bold.
I would like to move on to the decline of the peoples, I think, because we spoke a bit, we started this little bit by talking about cultivation.
Yes.
And how that's the aspiring for the universal and being in harmony with the universal, with your culture.
Yeah.
But then Hegel tells us how that also leads to the decline. Yeah. And basically, I think the answer is complacency. When you've reached a universal, when you've become what you were aiming to become, you're just going through the motions. Mm-hmm. You're no longer doing it with the aim of reaching it. You're just doing it because Hegel says it's become a habit. So he writes.
Where are we?
Page 160, I think, is where he properly talks about it. The second paragraph, the second moment, he says. Mm-hmm. He says, I have an interest in something only insofar as it is still concealed from me, or insofar as it is my purpose but is not yet fulfilled. And then he goes on to write, such a people that has fulfilled its purpose already, lives in the spirit of what it has become, in the spirit of what it sought and has been able to attain. It now lives within its habitual routine, which is what leads to natural death.
Yeah, in a way, it's living in the past, then its own past.
It's
Yeah,
living in its own past. It's living in a kind of, what we might say, I think habit is an interesting word. Hegel connects habits with mechanical relations. So there's something mechanical about just going through the motions of no
yeah,
longer explicitly no longer identifying your actions explicitly with this striving for the universal.
yeah.
Although they once had a sound basis, such earlier arrangements are now of little interest and are discontinued as unnecessary. A present without need ensues.
Yeah. But that is also like, there's a bit of a tragic tone to that, because it means unless we are unfulfilled, we will never be fulfilled in the present.
Yeah.
So it's a twisted paradox of being, right? Because if you get what you want, you're gonna be miserable.
Tragic is, I think, precisely the right word. It is through your very own resources that you will undermine yourself. It is by the Roman Empire becoming so great that it will decline. And there's
something cyclical about this.
Well, it's not cyclical, actually, because it's progress. Because from this declining, from this from the invasion of the Goths and the ransack of Rome, will emerge, for Hegel, Christian Europe, but more generally speaking, will emerge a new culture, a new universal, which will be an improvement on the old universal. So if we were talking about nature, you might say, maybe this is how certain kinds of histories conceive of the world. It's just a cyclical rising and falling of empires. That's all it is.
Yes.
Whereas Hegel wants to say, no, the reasons for why this one fell will provide reasons for why the next one will rise and why it will be an improvement.
Yes, so we get better empires.
We get better ones, bigger ones. Yeah. Do you have any other thoughts on this?
I see your point that the result is that there is a different society that is more developed, that arises out of the other one. However, my point about the cyclicality was to do with the very form itself as it laid out. That seems to be very cyclical, even though,
expand on that?
Yeah. So it's like you're building a staircase, and at each block you have these 4 moments, and then another block with the 4 moments. So true, you're making a progress, but every step is the same kind of step.
Yes, that's right.
So that's what I meant. It's formally the same 4 kind of moments in that cycle that is being repeated.
Yeah. I guess the interesting question then, we should probably hold this in the back of our minds as we progress through the lectures, is given this cyclical aspect to the progress of world history, how is it that we eventually reach an endpoint? How is it that we eventually reach a kind of cultivation, a kind of civilization that doesn't decline?
Yeah. And furthermore, whether it isn't built into the very idea of development that we should reach some sort of civilization like that, right?
Yeah.
That, maybe Kant's idea of a perpetual peace, right? A world federation of nation states, just working cooperatively together, everybody all the time, you know, following the categorical imperative and never ever lying. No.
Yeah. I mean, I wonder what it will look like.
That is, yes, a good question to raise, AHILLEAS. I think we should absolutely keep these things in mind as we progress, if we did progress,
if we ever managed, yeah. And I guess with that in mind, then we can look forward to the next section, the end of history, where Hegel might actually discuss the question you just raised.
Yes. Drop us a pretty big hint.
Yeah. But maybe we should leave that for next time.
Yeah, absolutely.
Good.
Well, thanks for listening in, people. Stick with us as we continue our progression, or whether we will just maybe cycle back and forth between things in this text. We'll see.
It remains to be seen. Yes.
It remains to be seen. Hope you enjoyed this. And thanks very much.
Yes, thank you very much. Bye-bye.